and Mr. LaTourette of Ohio for today.
Without objection, the requests are granted. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011, the gentlelady from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Christensen, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee for the Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that members may revise and extend their remarks on the subject matter of this special order.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And tonight we're here on the floor of the House of Representatives on the eve of the State of the Union by President Barack Obama, the first African-American president of the United States, and some 46 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which made his election and ours possible. And I'm pleased to be joined by members of the Congressional Black Caucus this evening for this special order, and I'd like to yield such time as he might consume to the gentleman from New York, I believe the most senior member of the Ways and Means Committee, a former chair of the Congressional Black Caucus and founding member of the Congressional Black Caucus, Mr. Charlie Rangel.
Without objection.
Let me thank the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands for having foresight in trying to protect our Constitution and the voting rights that all Americans are entitled. Before I get into the subject matter, I would like to really first thank the Speaker for pointing out the guidelines that we would have as it relates to the decorum of members in the House of Representatives. I think it's well heeded and we can walk away with some pride. I just assume that included in that was not to make derogatory remarks about the President of the United States, but recognizing that the whole body and the whole world has already spoken about this issue, then I don't think there's any need for me to elaborate. Because the reputation of the United States of America, no matter what we find in our fiscal system or whatever problems we have with our day-to-day and year-to-year problem, we still remain the source of hope and inspiration for people all over the world. People teach their kids that if they can only get to America, this is the place where you can come from the depth of poverty, and with hard work, education, there's no limit to how far you can go. And while we have fought over the years in order to get equality for those that main immigrants to this country were slaves, we do recognize that in this country offers all of us the best opportunity in the world to be able to provide a better life for ourselves, our kids, and for society generally. You know, Madam Chairlady, when the early 60s was there, and I marched from Selma to Birmingham, Alabama, it was 54 miles. But quite honestly, I don't know whether I've admitted this publicly or not, but I had no idea that I was going to march 54 miles. I thought I could go down, have my picture taken, and come back and say I was with Andy Young and John Lewis and Ralph Bunche and Dr. King. But somehow I got caught up in it, and I was cussing every step of the way, wondering how did I get caught up walking through all of these dark streets and being insulted. But much later, when I heard Lyndon Johnson say that word, that theme that had directed us emotionally and patriotically, that we shall overcome, I felt so proud, notwithstanding my lack of knowledge of the importance of the issue, that I did march. When I found out that the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, that it wasn't just something that made minorities feel good, it made Americans feel good. And the ripple effect of this throughout the world, we were able to say, see, we told you that in the United States is not what we want, but in the United States of America, we are working toward full equality. Now, even today, when we give assistance to a country that aspires to have a democracy, more often than not, they come here to see how we were able to do it, and we send people to watch what they are doing. And they listen to Americans teaching them what equality is and how to avoid fraud and how everybody should have an opportunity to participate. And notwithstanding what happens in America, we used to have a sense of pride that we have our problems, but still we're respected throughout the world. And what is happening today in certain states that have had long history of discrimination, it seems as though now they want to take this backward step to cause it to be difficult for people to vote. Why in the world would this great country want people not to vote? What could it be to have more and more people express themselves? You go to countries that got 80 and 90% of the population participating in this great democracy. And when you vote, you care more about the direction in which your country is going. God knows in America today, with the performance of the Congress, if the people were more involved, we'd do a better job and do it in a hurry. But having said that, these states are now changing their laws to make it difficult for people to vote. And even though I have my own suspicions as to why, if you lay out the facts and see what is happening, which states are they and what prohibitions are they putting? They're asking for ID. Well, do we have cases of people misusing ID? The Attorney General doesn't know of any. And then they're going after those who allow participation on Sundays. And then they're going after communities that are high number of poor people. Then they go into minority communities. Then they ask older people who have no reason for ID that they have to do it. And people who fought so hard for these rights that were given to them now find themselves in this late stage being denied the right to vote. It is so embarrassing. Not only is it not the right thing to do as Americans, but how can we continue to send people to foreign and developing countries as being the major spokespeople for democracy when right in this country we are prohibiting, not prohibiting, but discouraging people from participating in the right to vote. And I don't know whether the color of the president or the fact that this president had received record-breaking participation by the very same people that they're making it difficult to vote. But I tell you, for you taking the opportunity to bring the attention of this to the Congress and therefore to the nation, for you to be able with the Congressional Black Caucus to say that we're not protecting our rights, we're protecting our Constitution, we're protecting our country. And there's no question in my mind that we felt better as a people when we were able to overcome the obstacles that were placed. So let me thank you and my fellow colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus for saying we can vote. They can't hurt us, but it's a better country when everybody, regardless of their color, their age, or where they live, or how much money they have in the bank, to be able to say, in our country at this time, we have to move forward, and we cannot find ourselves where we were 60 and 70 years ago. So thank you so much for this opportunity and for all of the members who have taken time this evening to say that we shall indeed overcome for the length of the Constitution of this great nation.
Thank you, Mr. Rangel, and thank you again as a founding member of the Congressional Black Caucus for reminding the American people why we're called the conscience of the Congress. Thank you for those words. I'd like now to yield such time as she might consume to the gentlelady from Ohio who, for the last Congress, chaired these special orders and who's a leader on so many issues, and whose district, I believe, the CBC will again be traveling to help protect the rights of voters in Ohio. Congresswoman
Let me
Marsha
thank my
Fudge.
colleague who comes down to this floor every week. I know what it's like. I thank you for being the anchor for the CBC Hour. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to address the covert voter suppression effort underway in the United States of America. This effort might have begun as a stealth operation, but my colleagues, organizations across the nation, and I will ensure that Americans are informed and protected, such that voters are well prepared for the gimmicks underway to keep them from casting their ballots in 2012. During 2011, 34 states introduced legislation that would require voters to show a photo ID to cast a ballot. Approximately 13 states introduced bills to end Election Day and same-day voter registration. As many as 9 states introduced bills to reduce early voting, and 4 states proposed draconian reductions in absentee voting opportunities. 2 states took steps backwards by reversing prior executive actions that make it easier for citizens with past felony convictions to restore their voting rights. For many years, America has been described as a beacon of light for the world, the model of democracy and the home of fair elections. As a nation, we have always rejected voter intimidation at polling places in foreign nations. We frown upon nations that limit the right of its citizens to vote. Yet, we now face the same issues that fall disproportionately on the same class of voter that these very laws were designed to protect: the elderly, the disabled, students, minorities. I will not stand by, Mr. Speaker, and watch silently as state legislatures attempt to compromise the right of citizens to vote. And as a caucus, we will not be silent. We will not stand by idly as decades of struggle for equal voting rights are trampled upon. We will not turn our backs on voters who now face the erosion of the very premise upon which our nation is built, and that is the right to vote and to representation. I am proud to report, however, that 2012 is looking much better than 2011. Connecticut's Secretary of State and Governor introduced a package to streamline voter registration and increase access to absentee voting. In Florida, a bill was proposed to repeal legislation that shortened early voting periods and restricted voter registration drives. A bill introduced in Nebraska that would require a photo ID to vote was removed from the legislature's agenda. In Washington, a bipartisan bill was introduced that would allow 16-year-olds to pre-register to vote. The Department of Justice rejected South Carolina's photo ID law, and just last week, a circuit court in Wisconsin heard a case against Wisconsin's voter ID law. Looks like 2012 will be a very good year for the protection of voting rights. These attempts to restrict voting are especially hard on young voters. More than 1 million students attend colleges, universities, and technical schools in the state of Texas alone. But because of the state's new voter ID law, none will be allowed to use their student ID cards to cast a ballot. Texans, however, can show a gun permit and be allowed to vote, but a college student attempting to use their school-issued ID will be denied. Earlier this month, Bill O'Reilly vehemently defended laws like the one in Texas. He said if students don't know they can vote absentee, they're too stupid to vote. You're in college, but you're too stupid to vote. What an insult. During the Jim Crow era, people said African Americans were too stupid to vote. If you were black and you couldn't count the number of jelly beans in a jar or tell the person at the balloting box how many bubbles were in a bar of soap, you were too stupid to vote. We refuse to return to those days. Stand with us, protect the franchise, protect the right to vote. I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman Fudge, for those very strong words, and thank you for the ray of hope by pointing out some of the states that are reversing some of those laws or making it easier for their voters to vote. I'd now like to yield to the former chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, a leader not only in California but in the country, a person who has always been the conscience of the CBC as we are the conscience of the Congress, Congresswoman Barbara Lee.
Thank you very much. I thank the gentlelady for her kind remarks, and I also thank Congresswoman Christensen for her leadership. She serves as the first vice chair of the Congressional Black Caucus and has led on so many issues in this House on behalf of our country and on behalf of her constituents. Thank you very much. Let me also take a moment to thank Congresswoman Fudge and Congresswoman Jackson Lee, Congressman Bobby Scott, Chairman Rangel, for their leadership in defending the most basic element of our democracy, the right to vote. I'd also like to thank our Congressional Black Caucus Chair, Emanuel Cleaver, for his focus on this very critical issue. His leadership is making such a difference on so many important issues in our country. The right to vote is our most fundamental right that guarantees and preserves all other legal rights. When Americans lose their right to vote, that endangers their ability to defend further attacks on their rights. The assault on voters' rights continues in 2012. In this election year, a coordinated campaign designed to block access to the polls to tens of millions of Americans threatens to undermine our democracy and change election outcomes. And sadly, Mr. Speaker, it's no secret which communities these laws are designed to disenfranchise. Communities of color, students, elderly Americans, impoverished families, and the disabled. Let me say that the Republican legislators and governors who are pushing these anti-voter laws know exactly what they are doing. They saw the election results of 2008 with the surge of voter participation from Americans who had never voted before. They see the rising tide of Americans who seek to change their country by doing their basic civic duty on Election Day. Instead of embracing change, they are desperately trying to avoid change by undermining our voting process. These Republican legislators are proposing partisan laws that require voters to show a government-approved photo ID before voting. Those who are truly concerned about voter fraud have plenty of actual documented problems to take on. Why aren't they going after those who spread false information meant to trick voters or public officials who improperly purge eligible voters or political operatives who tamper with election equipment and forms? Instead, they all are pushing laws designed to change election outcomes by reducing voting, repressing turnout, and turning the clock back. Now, I have an aunt who is 100 years old, who was born at a time when records were not kept like they are today. How in the world would my aunt know where to start to find her birth certificate to be eligible to qualify for a government ID? How can I ask her to pay to do the research so she can figure out where her birth certificate may be and then pay to get a government ID to vote? Outrageous. 100 years ago, my aunt did not have the right to vote. Thanks to the hard work of those who came before us, my aunt witnessed the expansion of voting rights to women with the 19th Amendment and the protection of African American and other minority voters with the Voting Rights Act. These regressive laws seek to turn my aunt back to where she was a century ago, when she could not vote and her fundamental right to fully participate in our democratic society was cut off, mind you, just cut off by unjust laws. These partisan laws are shameful and a disgrace to our country. These anti-democratic efforts have no place in a modern democracy, and we must unmask these shameful attempts to disenfranchise voters. We encourage democracy and voting rights all around the world. I was an observer in the first election in South Africa where President Nelson Mandela was elected. I was an observer in the 90s in Nigeria. I witnessed long lines of people waiting patiently to vote. People believed and said to me that in America, voting was encouraged rather than discouraged. So we need to stop these partisan efforts that strike at the core of our democracy. It really is, Congresswoman Christensen, fundamentally anti-American. We have to win this war against voters. We should be about dismantling and reducing barriers so we can reignite their hope for the American dream. I want to again thank you for your leadership, and Congresswoman Fudge and Jackson Lee and Bobby Scott and Mr. Rangel and the entire Congressional Black Caucus for their calls and their hard work to protect the right to vote for all citizens across this nation. We must protect voters from these attempts to deny access to the heart of our democratic process. We need to move forward and encourage more voter participation. People need to know that they have a stake in this system and in this democracy. These laws were designed to stop that. Thank you again.
Thank you, Congresswoman Lee. And just to underscore what you have shared with us this evening, I don't usually quote from Politico, but let me read the last sentence of one of their articles. It says, "The framers bequeathed us a constitution intended to create a more perfect union. Every time an eligible voter is denied the right to vote, we are left that much further from achieving that goal." Thank you again for joining us this evening. And now I want to yield such time as he might consume to one of our outstanding constitutional experts and attorneys in the CBC, Congressman Bobby Scott from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. I thank the gentlelady from the Virgin Islands for the opportunity to speak. And today I rise in opposition to an unfortunate trend that seems to be creeping up all over the country, laws that add unnecessary complications to the process of voter registration and the process of voting. Now, some of these initiatives include photo ID laws, reduction in time to vote or to register to vote, laws complicating the rules for running voter registration drives. Now, none of these little schemes prevent individuals from voting, but the unnecessary complications guarantee that many will not get their paperwork in on time, and as a consequence, many will not be able to vote. In some states, those few votes can make the difference in a presidential election. Now, we need to protect the right to vote, not add unnecessary complications that will result in fewer people voting. But we see all over the country efforts to reduce the Election Day registration in those states that have allowed it for decades. Those who could have registered on Election Day will find that they cannot vote. In states that allow early voting, we're seeing efforts to reduce the number of days of early voting, meaning that some people may not be able to get their votes in as they could have with a longer period. In some states, the rules for voter registration drives are becoming more onerous, so much so that groups that have traditionally conducted voter registration drives, such as the League of Women Voters, are having second thoughts about conducting those drives under the new rules, and that will mean fewer people will be registered to vote. And many states are imposing for the first time a requirement that voters display a specific voter ID. This scheme that is so slanted that, as it's been previously stated, some government-issued IDs are acceptable and some are not. Texas proposed to accept the concealed weapons permit as acceptable government-issued ID, but not student IDs from a state college. Now, Mr. Speaker, these voter ID requirements are a solution in search of a problem. There is no credible evidence that in-person voter fraud, which is the only kind of fraud that the photo ID would prevent, is any problem around the country. In fact, multiple studies have found that virtually no cases of in-person voter fraud can be found. And the requirement of voter ID in subjecting people to that time and expense will guarantee that many will not get their paperwork in time. There are complications that can occur when you're trying to get that paperwork done. Some of the elderly have never gotten a photo ID and wouldn't know where to start. Many who are adopted may not know where to find a birth certificate. Many counties, for the elderly people, some counties have lost their records and the records aren't available. And it produces bizarre results, such as the nuns who were prohibited from voting because they didn't have photo ID, even though the election officials knew them personally. In Virginia, we have an exception to the photo ID. You have to present a photo ID, but if you don't have one, you can sign an affidavit under pains of a felony and go ahead and vote right now. But unfortunately, even in Virginia, they're trying to eliminate that exception and require people to go through the time and expense of getting photo ID if they don't have one. Now, if you want to look for problems in the voting process, maybe we ought to look at Iowa, that just certified, had announced that one person had won the Republican caucuses one day, and a couple of days later, certified results that another one had won. And there are public reports that suggest that really nobody knows who won. Maybe if you want to look for some voter irregularities, maybe we ought to look at that. Or maybe we ought to look at the candidate who tried to become a candidate on the Virginia Republican presidential primary this year. He has publicly stated that petition signatures submitted on behalf of his campaign, of those signatures, hundreds were in fact bogus. And if they had not been caught, he would have qualified for the ballot. But fortunately, it has been ascertained that so many were bogus signatures that he in fact did not qualify for the Virginia ballot. But as we see all over the country, efforts to reduce election day registration and other forms of ease in voting are making it possible for many people to lose those rights. Now, while the situations like Iowa and in Virginia, well, it's clear that those situations need scrutiny. There is no evidence that in-person voter fraud is a problem anywhere in the United States. Voting is not an arbitrary, inconsequential act. The cumulative effect of individuals voting elects our government officials who directly create our laws and policies. It is important that we ensure that every eligible voter is given the opportunity to vote, free from unnecessary barriers and schemes. Those schemes that erect barriers to the right to vote are unfair in our democracy. And I thank the gentlelady from the Virgin Islands for giving us the opportunity to make these statements.
I thank you for joining us and for pointing out some of that data and helping to explain to the American public the injustice that's being done by these voter restrictions on voting and restrictions on registration. We're also joined by another fighter for justice and equality, a strong voice in the Congressional Black Caucus, the gentlelady from Texas, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee.
I'd like to thank Dr. Christensen, which I enjoy calling her that, because she has been of such value and service to this Congress and to this body, the Congressional Black Caucus, and thank her for her leadership in convening this very important discussion on voter protection. I'm very delighted to be joined, and I thank him very much, by Congressman Bobby Scott, who served and we are serving on the Judiciary Committee, and I know that he remembers that in about 2006, 2007, after years of rumors of the Voting Rights Act ending, we clarified it by coming together in a bipartisan manner and over months of hearings convinced then I believe a Republican and moving into a Democratic Congress, but a bipartisan Congress, that the Voting Rights Act was needed and it needed to be reauthorized in certain sections. And so our stand today is to reinforce that issue. And so I would like to thank again Congressman Rangel, who so movingly told of his long journey and walk to support the Voting Rights Act, Congresswoman Fudge, who has been a champion in her state in Ohio, Congresswoman Lee, and then Congressman Scott, who all bring to the table a personal story about voter protection. But I must make mention of our friend Congressman John Lewis, who is the epitome of the civil rights movement around the idea of voter protection and enhancement. Many of us are not aware of Congressman Filner, who was one of the Freedom Riders and celebrated the Freedom Riders in the last year, their 50 years. My colleague, Congressman Al Green, who led the NAACP in Houston during times when we were under siege as it relates to voting opportunities. And I remember working for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and in the South in the aftermath in the 1970s of the Voting Rights Act, actually going to many states, from North Carolina to South Carolina to Georgia and Alabama, where African Americans were still not registered, had still not had the full impact. I remember walking miles with Purdue University to allow students to vote. So this is a cause that we have been on a long journey, and it saddens me that we're here again fighting for voter protection in the year 2012 as we look to our presidential elections. I might offer to my colleagues the words of Barbara Jordan, who could not have come to Congress if it had not been for the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Sitting in the Judiciary Committee, she offered these words: "I believe hyperbole would not be fictional and would not overstate the solemnness I feel right now. My faith in the Constitution is whole, it is complete, it is total." She said that, of course, during the impeachment hearings of Richard Nixon, but really the point was that she felt that the Constitution breathed life, if you will, in the rights of Americans. And the Constitution spoke to the voting rights of African Americans and others through the 14th and 15th Amendment. But over the years, we had not been protected, and so the Congress, through the leadership and sacrifice of Dr. Martin Luther King, whose monument is magnificent, they passed the Voting Rights Act, and it was challenged. The constitutionality was challenged in 1966. It barely got passed. And the Supreme Court said this: "Congress has found that case-by-case litigation was inadequate to combat widespread and persistent discrimination in voting." This is what they found over the years in the Deep South, that it was constant, it was ongoing, because of the inordinate amount of time and energy required to overcome the obstructionist tactics invariably encountered in these lawsuits. After enduring nearly a century of systemic or systematic resistance to the 15th Amendment, Congress might well decide to shift the advantage of time and inertia from the perpetrators of evil to its victims. That was a landmark case in 1966, South Carolina versus Katzenbach, the Attorney General of the United States, to reaffirm the Voting Rights Act of 1966. Here we now, almost 50 years plus, where we are fighting this case again, and I might add, in not too friendly a climate. First of all, fraud is offered, and I noticed that my colleague mentioned the unfortunate facts or the circumstances in Iowa where one Republican presidential candidate was declared a winner and then now another. And I did not hear voices being raised about whether there was fraud. Maybe it was a miscount, a mistake. But you didn't hear the outrage that we have heard over the seemingly increase or the effort to increase the votes of poor people and minorities, and in particular Latinos and African Americans. And might I just say, with a sense of pride, the Honorable Barbara Jordan added Texas to the Voting Rights Act coverage by adding language minorities, I believe, in about 1978. But the thought that fraud is bad and should be prosecuted, but photo ID does not prevent voter impersonation, that it doesn't work. Requiring a photo ID amounts to discrimination. 11% of the entire voting eligible population, 2.1 million, do not have government-issued photo ID. You're discriminating against them. 25% of eligible African American voters do not have qualified voter ID. In a 2006 nationwide study of voting-age citizens by the Brennan Center for Justice of the New York University School of Law found that African Americans are more than 3 times as likely as Caucasians to lack a government-issued ID. You talk to many of our seniors, and they were born with midwives. My mother, God rest her soul, we could not, as long as we looked for her birth certificate, could not find it, but she did have a voter registration card. Nationwide, 18% of eligible voters over 65 lack an ID. Photo ID laws are costly and add to the deficit. Missouri estimates that ID would cost, or the ID law would cost the state over $20 million to implement. And it goes on to say North Carolina, $14 million. This is a shame on us. This is a pox on our house. And it is a pox on our house because fraud cannot be documented. As my colleague indicated, how ironic it is that a student ID, students at state colleges, private colleges, historically black colleges, Hispanic-leaning colleges, can't use a credible ID that colleges take great pride or great efforts to secure. Photo ID. Young people who we want to see cherish the democracy of this country cannot in fact use their ID, but yes, a gun ID can be used. And just a few weeks ago in the Judiciary Committee, somewhat related, we were trying to pass legislation that says if you have a gun ID in Georgia, you can use your gun permit in another state. We're willing to give all these rights to those carrying gun ID, which may in fact jeopardize our law enforcement officers in all of the different states by not knowing who's in there carrying a gun permit, but yet the sacred and simple act of being able to vote by a person of your choosing causes the ire of so many state legislatures who, after the 2010 election and the misrepresentation that there was fraud in the 2008 election, maybe because we elected the first African-American president or some crisis generated this response, we have this kind of map that shows practically 40 states, it looks like, that have a
all but 11.
How many?
All but 11.
All but 11. Thank you. That require photo ID, that photo ID is requested, that photo ID legislation is proposed. Congresswoman, I ask, on what basis have we now taken the Constitution, the Voting Rights Act, and the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act to do it? Let me just share these points as I come to a close and ask that we continue the efforts. I look forward to a voter protection meeting by the Congressional Black Caucus in Houston. The state of Texas has the voter ID law that is now being pre-cleared. I understand that all my colleagues are in the middle of redistricting, but let me just say this is not in any way promoting Texas, but I believe that we may be the singular case that is going to ascertain the integrity of the Voting Rights Act and voter protection. Right now, Texas is in 3 courts: the Supreme Court, the District Court of Appeals here in the District of Columbia, and the San Antonio Federal Court. We are fighting on 3 different levels. And I might say this without any punitive comments intended. We had an interim plan, and this is under the Voting Rights Act, one person, one vote. And Congresswoman, I think it is important to note that the Voting Rights Act protects all Americans. Its premise is one vote, one person. Its premise is not fraud, but opportunity. So when we have the redistricting and some sections of the Voting Rights Act protects the idea of one person, one vote, we're in our, we take these cases not for personal promotion, meaning members of Congress and state legislators, but to ensure the integrity of the vote. And so when the court ruled in San Antonio, just briefly, that the plan did not work that the state of Texas wrote and gave us a new plan, the state of Texas went to the Supreme Court, not the individuals trying to protect the right of voters, went to the Supreme Court to stay that plan. Well, the Supreme Court did render a decision. We're still in the midst of our confusion, but I just have to put this on the record. The Supreme Court assessed us, the ones who did not appeal, $18,000 to pay for printing. For those of us who are lawyers, we are simply questioning and in wonderment of how you can charge individuals who did not take the case up to the Supreme Court, who were being guided by the federal court, who had a plan, and assess us $18,000. I simply say, here is another way that you can not protect voting, because inevitably those who are on the side of the Voting Rights Act are not rich. We inevitably, in many instances, are not the state. It's the state coming against those who are trying to say one vote, one person. I bring this up just as I close. And let me just say that in the course of the hearings that we had in reauthorizing the Voting Rights Act, we discovered that there were problems with voting across the country. In 2004, nearly 4,500 people reported problems with ballots that were coming to them. 1,000 people reported voting intimidation. 7,000 reported registration problems. And as you well know, the status of voting laws now, meaning the voting ID or voter identification, limits the kind of voter ID you can use. It excludes the most common forms of identification, student ID, Social Security cards, and they offer no alternative. The changes requiring proof of citizenship as a condition for voter registration, limitations or outright elimination of early voting opportunities, and barriers to first-time voters by suggesting that there are no same-day registration. So I would simply argue that this is an important special order that you have tonight. What I feel in my heart is that we have to educate the public. They have to raise their level of not anxiety, but cause, that they have a cause. They've got to get their marching shoes on again. They've got to get their shoes of being the carriers of justice as those civil rights legends and heroes did. They've got to get like the movie The Help, when those domestics, those people who worked for others, walked in the Montgomery bus boycott because they were trying to do for others. So I want to thank you for allowing me to share with you this evening, and I want to indicate that this very fine letter that was sent by members of Congress to the Attorney General on July 25th, 2011 should be upheld, that we want to have these voter ID laws that may suppress the vote. We want to have voter protection by having a vigorous review of all of these laws, and one of them happens to be the voter ID requirement in the state of Texas. Thank you for allowing me to participate in an opportunity to share and an opportunity to tell a message to our colleagues that the justice of voting is the justice for everyone, and the protection of voting is the protection of voting for everyone. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you for those strong words. And again, I'm going to go back to the article in Politico because everyone has made reference to the charges of fraud. And this article I'm quoting says, official and academic studies have consistently shown that the chances of being hit by lightning are greater than the likely incidence of such fraud. So today, as we prepare for elections in November of this year, as you've heard, we've seen an unprecedented, at least unprecedented since August of 1965, attack on the right of Americans to vote. These attacks, as you've heard, have taken many forms: expanding bans that prevent felons from voting, cutting election administration budgets in states, curtailing early voting, something that was used very effectively in previous elections, eliminating same-day registration, intimidating voter registration by some groups, which extends in some places to intimidation on election day, imposing strict ID requirements, creating barriers to getting the required ID, and creating barriers to voting by students in schools outside of their state. Again, the voter fraud claims are bogus, and as our chairman, Emanuel Cleaver, said in testimony before the Senate Committee on Judiciary late last year, and I'm quoting our chairman, "The laws are solutions in search of problems, especially when it comes to voter ID, because there is basically no evidence of fraud," end of quote. And many studies, as I've said, have supported that statement. With an estimated 11% of Americans not having IDs that would meet the requirement, it is projected that these new attacks on the right of American citizens to vote will prevent many millions of people, mostly Democrats, mostly minorities and elderly, from voting, and could affect as many as 171 electoral votes. It is clear to me that whether racially based or not, this is a direct attempt not only to undermine the election process, but a specific attempt to derail what surely would be and ought to be the re-election of Barack Obama. The CBC is speaking out, as is the NAACP, but I'm still waiting for the cries of many of the good people in this country. This is an egregious injustice and a threat to democracy and to the stability of our nation, and it must not be allowed to continue. The Congressional Black Caucus has met with officials of the Justice Department and has written, Congresswoman Jackson Lee referred to the letter, a letter with over 100 other members signing, a letter to the Attorney General, Eric Holder, registering our grave concern over these laws and proposed laws and urging that the Department of Justice examine them and ensure that the rights of voters are protected. And in March, we will take up the torch of those who marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge to continue to fight for equal rights, and together with the NAACP and other partners begin a voter protection tour to key cities to call attention to the injustice, to mobilize efforts to help individuals get the required ID or vote in where there still remains some early voting, and to continue to press the Justice Department to do all that is in their authority to protect this right that so many fought, sacrificed, and died for. As Congresswoman Jackson Lee showed, this is the map. It's called the map of shame. Only 11 states don't have a voter ID law or is requesting one or has legislation proposed. How will we ever be able to lead and speak for the rights of the disenfranchised in other parts of the world? That was something raised by Congressman Rangel as we began this special order. Where will we get the moral authority if this travesty is allowed to exist and we undermine this very fundamental right, the right to vote? Already the undue influence of big money from undisclosed donors is influencing elections. Already the ugly specter of racism has been raised to divide our country and to misinform and inflame some segments of our country. This is not the country that we want to be. The Voting Rights Act was passed in August of 1965, and at that time ended over a century of denial of the right to vote to African Americans in the South and to Latinos in the Southwest as well. In voting rights, as in health care reform, as someone said earlier, we are not going back. I'd like to just use a few minutes of the time that we have left to call attention to a crisis in my district in the U.S. Virgin Islands. On last Wednesday, January 18th, we suffered an economic earthquake with the announcement that the Hovenza oil refinery, it's either the second or the third largest oil refinery in the Western Hemisphere, is going to close in the middle of February. Now, we're a small community, 110 throughout the entire Virgin Islands, but maybe about 55,000 on the island of St. Croix. So a hit of over 2,000 jobs is a big hit to our economy, and those are the direct jobs, people that work either for Hess or their subcontractors on the site. They'll continue to keep about 100 employees for oil storage facilities, but the impact will reverberate throughout that entire community. Businesses who rely on Hovenza, from some of their suppliers to hotels and restaurants, and even some of our private schools are wondering how they are going to survive and keep their doors open when Hovenza closes. We're looking at a number of issues. We still have a lot of questions that we need to ask, but I wanted to bring this to the attention of my colleagues because this is a severe crisis. We were already, as all of our states have been, having to do layoffs and cutting salaries and imposing austerity measures on our population. But the closing of this refinery is a major hit, and it's left my community reeling. So I ask for your prayers, and at the appropriate time I will probably come and ask for your assistance, and on behalf of the people of the Virgin Islands. I want to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues, Congressman Rangel, Congresswoman Fudge, Congressman Scott, Congresswoman Lee, Congresswoman Jackson Lee, for joining me for this special order to speak to the issue of voter protection for the people of this country, the protection of a fundamental right that must not be abridged. Would you like to, did you want to have some more time, Congresswoman Lee? Jackson
if the
Lee?
gentlelady would yield for a moment.
Sure.
First, I want to speak to the gentlelady's last comment and say that you have been a champion for the Virgin Islands. I have the privilege of having several meetings there. They are generous people. They are our neighbors. And so I personally want to say experiencing and understanding the impact of the loss of a major entity is something many of us have gone through. And in this instance, I wanted to say, yes, we will stand with you and be of help. And I'm introducing legislation that deals with trying to look at the energy industry in a way to help it grow in a fair way, to be environmentally safe. And I know that you are certainly someone who is a champion of the environment, but have found that that business has served economically. And I want to make sure that we have these kinds of industries and they're not mutually exclusive. I don't have the facts of what has generated this action, but we need to be helpful. My legislation talks about using the energy industry to also support improving the environment, and I think that creates jobs as well. So I just want to say that I look forward to working with you, and thank you for bringing that issue to our attention, because as voter protection gives people the opportunity for expressing their views, we know that the opportunity for work and for jobs is crucial as well. I yield back to the gentlelady.
I thank you for your support, and I know that I'll have the support of the Congressional Black Caucus. And it just raises the issue of that we have been coming to the floor for the entire year to speak on before this evening, and that's jobs and job creation. Mine, like other communities across the country, will definitely need to enact legislation like the American Jobs Act and some of the countless pieces of legislation that the Congressional Black Caucus has introduced in this Congress to create jobs for the people who are the people in this country. I just wanted to add that in addition to the impact on the U.S. Virgin Islands and St. Croix in particular, this closing will have a major impact, especially on the East Coast, as Hovenza has been a major supplier of gasoline to the East Coast. So, again, I ask for your prayers and your support, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Right to Life movement is the greatest human rights movement on earth, a remarkable decades-long struggle embraced by millions of selfless women and men of all ages, races, colors, and creeds, and made up in recent years, I'm happy to say, disproportionately of young people. We defend and seek to protect all the weak and vulnerable persons from the violence of abortion, infanticide, and euthanasia. We believe in the politics and policies of inclusion, regardless of race, age, sex, disability, or condition of dependence. Yesterday, January 22nd, marked the 39th year since the infamous holdings of Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton, the pair of Supreme Court decisions that nullified fundamental pro-life protections throughout the United States. The catastrophic loss of children's lives since Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton has been absolutely numbing. Over 54 million children have been killed by dismemberment, chemical poisoning, lethal pills, suction, and starvation. Let's not forget that RU-46 is a chemical compound. It's two chemicals, and one of the effects of one of those chemicals is to literally starve the baby in the womb to death. The second chemical brings on delivery of a dead baby. Women have been harmed by abortion as well. Over 100 studies show significant psychological harm, major depression, and elevated suicide risk in women who abort. The Times of London wrote, senior psychiatrists say that new evidence has uncovered a clear link between abortion and mental illness in women with no previous history of psychological problems. They found that women who had abortions had twice the level of psychological problems and 3 times the level of depression as women who give birth or who have never been pregnant. Younger women are also harmed by abortion psychologically. A comprehensive New Zealand study found that almost 80% of 15 to 18-year-olds who had abortions displayed symptoms of major depression as compared to 31% of their peers. Abortion also has a deleterious effect on subsequent children born to women who have aborted. At least 113 studies show significant association between abortion and subsequent premature births. One study by Shah and Zhou showed a 36% increased risk for preterm birth after 1 abortion and a staggering 93% increased risk after 2. What does this mean for subsequent children born to women who have had abortions? Preterm birth is the leading cause of infant mortality in the industrialized world after congenital abnormalities or anomalies. Preterm infants have a greater risk of suffering from chronic lung disease, sensory deficits, cerebral palsy, and cognitive impairments and behavioral problems. Low birth weight, which is also one of the consequences, is associated with neonatal mortality and motility. Finally, Mr. Speaker, at the March for Life today, there were large numbers of people, tens of thousands of people. As co-chair of the Pro-Life Caucus, I was proud to stand with so many of our lawmakers here, many of whom are on the floor tonight, and also with our leadership. Speaker John Boehner, Majority Leader Cantor, Kevin McCarthy, and Jeb Hemsling, among the most profoundly important speeches made about the sanctity and the dignity of human life. And they have produced the No Taxpayer Funding for Abortion Act, H.R. 3, which not only would be a government-wide prohibition on government funding for abortion, it also had a robust, very significant conscience clause as part of that legislation. The Protect Life Act, and of course the defunding of Planned Parenthood, a group that aborts in its clinics some 330,000 abortions, 330,000 dead babies in its clinics each and every year. It was a great march, and we had Women from Silent No More campaign, post-abortive women, who eloquently speak to all women not to have abortions because they are the ones who have been victimized by it, but also as a pathway to healing and reconciliation for those who have. This movement is all about forgiveness and all about reconciliation and reaching out to those who are on the other side, especially post-abortive women. I'd like to now yield to Marcia Blackburn, distinguished gentlelady from Tennessee. Which such time is she making so?
I thank the gentleman from New Jersey for yielding the time. Mr. Speaker, you know, he said something that is so important. This is a special day. It's a somber day and solemn in many ways, but yet it is a day when you think about hope and encouragement and reconciliation. We all have had constituents who have come in today to express their opinion and to mark this 39 years, to be here to protest 39 long, painful years of government-sanctioned abortion on demand. My constituents and many Tennesseans that came here today and that gathered in churches and at the state capitol in Nashville have done it for two reasons. One is to protest abortion. The other is to show respect for life. They have spoken with one voice. Life is a beautiful gift from God, and no government should be able to take that life away. We know in our hearts what is true. Life is a natural right, and the Declaration of Independence calls for us to protect the smallest and the weakest among us. After all, there is no independence without our most basic fundamental right, the right to life. There are a couple of things that have concerned many of us lately. One is abortion being smuggled into our health care system through Obamacare. It is something that I think is morally indefensible. It is fiscally irresponsible. It is an issue that we're going to hear more about each and every day as we go through the year. As a woman, I believe that America and our citizens deserve better than abortion. And I believe, and this is the second thing that has really caught a lot of attention lately, and an area where we're going to place some additional attention this year, and that is on Planned Parenthood. America deserves better than Planned Parenthood, and it's important that everyone realize, Mr. Speaker, that Planned Parenthood continues to profit from the destruction of human life with taxpayer money. This year, we are going to delve into that issue a little bit more and find out more about what has happened with these funds in the organization of Planned Parenthood. Today, as our constituents have come into the city, we have been encouraged, and we have encouraged others. It's nice to be able to encourage one another. We all have prayed for the millions of women and children who are hurt by abortion, and we have also prayed that God will provide the courage and the steadfastness that is needed for us to put an end to this national tragedy. I yield back.
I want to thank my friend Ms. Blackburn for very eloquent comments and thank her for her leadership. I'd like to now yield to gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Schmidt, who has led both in Ohio when she was there in the legislature as well as here in Washington.
Thank you so much to my good friend, Mr. Smith from New Jersey. Your courage on this issue will not go unnoticed. And I really, Mr. Speaker, wanted to talk to you tonight about a little girl with a 2-inch foot and the lasting impression that that little 2-inch foot has made. I come from southern Ohio, and my parish is St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, led by Father Michael Courtier. Father Courtier has a brother, Andy, and his sister-in-law by the name of Ann. And just recently, they buried their 5-month-old daughter. Sophia Grace Courtier was born with a chromosomal condition, one that was diagnosed long before she was born. The doctors made the suggestion that perhaps they should abort the child because the risks were so great that she wouldn't even be born alive. Given the statistics, even if she were born alive, that it was likely she would not make her first birthday. So why bother? But Ann and Andy understand the meaning of life at all levels. They know that life is precious, and they knew that her life was worthy of respect. The amazing thing is not just the hundreds of people that came to the funeral, but what happened on December 23rd. See, the Cincinnati Enquirer had a front-page story on the miracle baby, and they showed the risks, but they also talked about life and pro-life positions. Our Cincinnati Enquirer, at the funeral, there were many pictures of Sophia Grace, but the one that left the imprint on my mind were her little 2-inch footprints. And her mother had, and I wish I could remember the exact words, typed up something that said to the point that no matter how small the footprint, every footprint can make a lasting impression. Had Sophia not been born, the Enquirer wouldn't have run this story. It wouldn't have provoked the discussion for life. And who knows what other child would have been saved. Ann told me at the funeral that the value of each life each person has, no matter their shortcomings or faults, should be loved and cherished and protected. Ann has it right. I believe many people in this Congress have it right. And I know that the Americans at heart have it right. And so today, while hundreds of thousands marched on the lawn of the Capitol in the rain to protest a really bad decision that was made 39 years ago, I saw Sophia's little footprints in my mind. And as I saw those footprints on the lawn, I thought, those big footprints are making as lasting of an impression as little Sophia. Because no matter how great or how small, we all have life's value because we are children of God. I yield back.
I thank my good friend for her excellent statement. Mr. Walberg, if I'd like to yield.